Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible class. Today we're going to be taking a look at Genesis chapter 9. This is the chapter immediately following Noah's flood, where God makes a covenant with Noah and uses a rainbow as the sign of that covenant. But what exactly is a covenant? The Bible talks about a lot of different covenants, but do we even really understand what a covenant is in the context of the Bible? Our goal today is to look at this covenant that God makes with Noah a little bit deeper. This is the first time in the text that the word covenant is explicitly used, so the conclusions we draw about the covenant that God makes with Noah, we should be able to use looking forward at the other covenants God makes with man. So let's dive into the text. Starting at verse 8, we read, "Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, Behold, I now establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth, every living thing that came out of the ark. And I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." So here we see God making a covenant with Noah. But how do we define a covenant? A very simple definition of covenant is a binding agreement between two parties. We see a lot of these in the text in different forms, but they all share a few common features. Number one, every covenant needs to be between two parties. There cannot be a one-man covenant. Sometimes in a covenant, only one person is required to do something, but the covenant is always between two parties. In addition to that, every covenant needs to establish the terms of the agreement. It's like, what are the stipulations of that agreement? What are they agreeing to? And who is required to do what? And the final piece is that all covenants need to have a sign, some outward expression that the covenant is being kept. The sign of the covenant is not some magical device that makes the covenant valid or invalid, but rather just an outward expression showing that the parties are still participating in that covenant. Although the term covenant is used a lot in the scriptures, in our modern vernacular, we don't really use the word all that much, with one exception, the covenant of marriage, which again has to be between two parties, and there needs to be some terms of that agreement, and there needs to be some sort of an outward sign showing that both parties are still keeping that agreement. In most modern weddings, the terms of the agreement are summarized in the vows portion, where the husband says what he's going to do and that he's going to vow to do this, that, and the other thing. And then the wife says that what she vows to do and she's going to do all this other stuff. And then this is all done in the sight of an officiator and in the presence of all their friends and family as witnesses to that agreement. For my wedding, my wife and I actually wrote up a marriage contract, or ketubah, that we had printed out on a piece of metal, and it was on display at our wedding ceremony. Then I read our contract out loud so that all of our friends and family and the officiator of the wedding could hear the terms of the agreement for our particular marriage covenant we're going to be. Then I signed it, then my wife signed it, then the officiator signed it, and then we had two witnesses sign it in the presence of all of the guests and our friends and family, with the expectation that they're going to help hold us accountable to those terms. And as an outward sign of our covenant, we decided to go the traditional route and exchange rings. Again, a wedding ring is not some magical device that makes me married and unmarried when I take it on and off, but it does serve as a reminder to myself and those around me that I'm in covenant relationship with my wife. So whenever we come across covenants in the text, we should stop and ask, one, who was the parties involved? Two, what are the terms of that covenant? And three, what is the outward sign of that covenant? Speaking of covenants in the text, there are a whole bunch of covenants in the text. Some of those covenants are between people and other people, like David and Jonathan make a covenant between them. Sometimes they're between nations and other nations, and sometimes they're between God and man. And those are the ones that we and most people tend to focus on. How many of those are there? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask. There's either 6 or 7 or 8 or more or less covenants between God and man. For our purposes, we're going to mention 6 of them that we're all familiar with. starting with the Noahic covenant between God and Noah after the flood. I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list, and I know that there are some that argue that there were covenants made before this, whether it's a covenant that God made in the Garden of Eden or a covenant made with Adam, but the term covenant isn't explicitly used early in Genesis, and its first usage is referring to the covenant God makes with Noah. So I'm just going to say that this is the first one. After this, as we continue through Genesis, we get to the Abrahamic covenant between God and Abraham. And later in the Torah, we're going to get to the Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant, which then leads to the Aaronic covenant between the priesthood and ultimately the Davidic covenant with the kings. And jumping up into the prophets and apostolic scriptures, we have the New Covenant. But let's zoom in a bit on this Noahic covenant and see how this thing is constructed and see how this works. Like we said earlier, we need to answer three main questions. Who are the parties involved? What are the terms of the agreement? And what is the sign that the agreement is being kept and upheld? While we call this the Noahic covenant, the covenant is not just between God and Noah. In 9:16 and 17, God says that this covenant is between him and every creature on the earth, not just Noah. And it appears that the terms of this agreement are pretty one-sided in this one. God seems to be bearing the burden of this covenant, and there's not really much responsibility on Noah or any other creature. God very clearly states in verse 11 that he will never again destroy the earth with a flood. This doesn't mean that there will never be floods or never be destruction by water. This means that God will never destroy the entire earth again with water. That last part is important. With water. You see, in 2 Peter 3, when discussing the last days or end times, we learn that there will be scoffers and mockers and those who say that the end will never come. But starting in verse 5, they deliberately overlooked the fact that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water, and by water through which the world of that time perished in the flood. And by that same word, the present heaven and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. What we see happening here in the book of Genesis is a foreshadowing of what is still yet to come in the future. Although God will not destroy the earth by water again, as he's made a covenant with Noah, he is still the judge, and he is still going to judge the earth in righteousness. But next time, he's going to use fire. So if the terms of the agreement are that God will never destroy the earth with a flood, the sign of that covenant is the rainbow. As we read in Genesis 9, starting in verse 12, and God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." The text then goes on to talk about every time that there are clouds in the sky and that it rains, that God will see his rainbow and remember the covenant that he is making with Noah, and he will never again destroy the earth with a flood. This is great news. Every time we look up and see a rainbow, we can remember that God is remembering his covenant that he made with Noah, that he is not going to destroy the world with this rain, that this flood will not destroy all life. And this is exciting news, but it's also kind of scary news. You see, the rainbow should also serve as a reminder that God did flood the whole earth because of its sin, because the thoughts of man's heart were only evil continuously, that God is the righteous judge. While I can be comforted in knowing that there's not going to destroy the world with water, I know that he is going to destroy the world with fire, as we already read in 2 Peter 3. Now, I find it a bit ironic that the homosexual community has chosen the rainbow as its banner, because the rainbow should be reminding us that God is judge and that we are sinful. The sight of the rainbow should remind us that God is holy and we are not. It should be the very sign that calls us back to his word, that calls us back to keeping his standards and his commandments. But instead, the world takes the sign of this covenant that God makes with Noah and does exactly what Peter said they would do. Back in 2 Peter 3, starting in verse 3, He says, most importantly, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. Where is the promise of his coming? They will ask. Ever since our fathers fell asleep, everything continues as it has from the beginning of creation. They will totally disregard and discard God's standards and God's judgments, and instead will scoff and mock at them. It's kind of scary when you think about it. But before we wrap up for the day, let's take a look back at those covenants that God makes with man in the Bible. You see, we often think of covenants as a linear progression, and that these covenants are mutually exclusive. And if you're in one covenant, you're not in another covenant. And we start taking these covenants and we put them in a line, like we leave the Noahic covenant and enter the Abrahamic covenant, and we leave the Abrahamic covenant and enter the Mosaic covenant. And as time goes on, we continue to progress through these different covenants. But that's not the picture that the Bible gives us of these covenants. And I'll argue that's not even what most of us actually think about these. As we've been talking this whole time, we are still living in the Noahic covenant. God will still not destroy the earth by flood. This is still binding today, thousands of years later. It was not undone or abrogated by the Abrahamic covenant. The covenants that God made with Abraham in Genesis 15 were not undone when God made a covenant with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. And that covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai was not undone when he made a covenant with Aaron and Aaron's sons to be priests forever. You see, the picture of covenants that the Bible gives us is one of stacking covenants, that each covenant builds upon the one before it. There are different terms, different stipulations, and often different parties involved, but not to the abrogation of the covenants that came before it. Rather, these covenants build upon one another and create the framework with which all of the biblical narrative and biblical promises hang. And when we get a proper understanding of how these covenants stack up on one another, we can truly see God's grace, his mercy, and his plan for salvation from beginning to end. So thanks for joining us today here at Bible Class. That's a lot of information and a lot of stuff about covenants. And as we continue through the text, we'll keep looking at those covenants and seeing how they work and how they fit together and how they stack up upon one another. Here in Genesis, we're laying the foundation and groundwork for how we're going to read and interpret all of the scriptures. If you have any questions or criticisms or comments or critiques, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And be sure to check out our next video on Genesis chapter 10, where we take a look at the table of nations and the 70 nations that filled the earth. But that's next time on Bible Class.